Greetings, this is Michael Erlewine, and I want to just share with you a conversation I'm going to have with Philip Graves. It's about a large collection of astrological materials I'm going to place in the hands of 2 or 3 people in the astrological community, and for them to make that available to all of you who are interested. Philip Graves is very similar to me in spending his life archiving astrology, so he's going to be the main representative of my materials. Yeah, so I thought we should talk about this in person a bit. Also,
Excellent.
We could use this a little bit. I could do a little bit of an interview of you, just of your work. That I think
What
that
a nice idea.
You're basically what I'm doing is preparing this hard drive. It's like 4 terabytes.
Yes.
With a lot of my life's work, because I'm getting older and I'm going to die at some point, and you don't know when, because I've had a bunch of heart attack stuff and strokes, and I don't know whether I'll be around. So I'm placing this hard drive with 3 people, and I'm going to talk to you. I don't know how much you know about me, but I have quite a history of archiving, not just astrology stuff.
Oh, yes.
But the largest music film, one of the 2 largest film databases in the world, and the largest music database. I don't own it anymore, which I'm happy to say. And my CD collection is now at Michigan State University. It's 800,000 CDs.
Phenomenal. Absolutely
some
phenomenal.
idea.
Yes.
So, and then I have other ones at University of Michigan, Bentley Historical Library, and stuff like that. But the astrology thing, I'm a little more worried about. And I send that to you. Anything that you want to do with my stuff, like if people come, but I'm trusting you to be a real archivist, because you are a real archivist. And
I do my best.
I feel that you and I are kindred spirits, that we're doing the same exact thing, except I'm a lot older and I've already done what I'm going to do, but you're still cooking and doing well. So anything I give you, you are welcome to give to anyone. And if you need to make money in order to do it, because you have to do some work on it, do so. You have my total permission to do that.
Generous of you, Michael. Thank you.
I mean, I'm waiting. It'll be a little time. I'm waiting for 120 audio tapes to be digitized and returned to me. But these are lots and lots of Michelle Gauquelin, almost every astrologer you can think of.
Oh, wonderful.
So if you want to market those or do anything you want, all I care about is it gets in the hands of people.
Yes,
right.
Of course.
And I think you understand that principle.
Definitely.
Well. So I'm trying to think of what other thoughts I have about that. The other stuff that people, I'm going to also tell people that you have a copy of this. I mean, that you're my representative archivist, or whatever you want to call yourself.
Okay.
But I'm saying if little people, small people need something, like I have 13,000 tarot card images that I made, for instance, of every kind of astrological. They're not very great, but they can help illustrate stuff. You're to give them to them. Charge a fee to do whatever you have to do. But I'm worried that I would like to see everything I have used as much as humanly possible.
Yes.
So how are you? I'm sorry just to talk about that, but I got to get through some of that stuff. So maybe you'd like to tell me a little bit about how you got into what you're doing.
Well, certainly. Well, I began just as an ordinary student of astrology when I was in my gap year at university studying. I was abroad teaching English in a school to fulfill the requirements of a year abroad towards my French degree. And at the same time, a friend of my father's who had a couple of old Lyndon Goodman books sent me out a book by Barbara Dunn and Archie Dunlop, which teaches in a very simplified manner, sort of Grant Lewis style simplicity, how to construct a birth chart and find out the positions of the planets and calculate transits and so on. But it was all based on tables. It wasn't exact. So later that same year, I bought Parker's Astrology, which had its own more accurate ephemeris in the back, and I started to do the calculations more accurately. And I was just totally absorbed by finding out the placements of everybody I knew, my family, my work colleagues, my friends, and so on, and basically testing the delineations in these books against my experience of reality, and that took me then in the following years to starting to buy more books. And before I graduated as a BA in French, I had about 60. And then a few years after that, I got into the MSN community online, where there was a chat room dedicated to astrology at the time. And one of the regulars from there, a man from Los Angeles, set up his own separate MSN groups site, which was a kind of big community network, you may remember. And that was on
I remember the MSN because I was probably running that astrology. I ran 110 New Age, but it didn't last long because MSN didn't last long. But I think that must have been one of my sites, because I had, I was doing. I don't want to interrupt you. I'm just saying, I probably was I wasn't personally on it, but I was providing that for them. 110 New Age, and that has to be one of them.
Yes, well. Anyway, this character from Los Angeles, he was called, I think he was called Raoul, his real name, but he used the name Raw Biscuit as a kind of screen name, because everybody was using screen names. It was before the kind of real name trend took over on social media and so on. And he was just deeply interested in spirituality and all kinds of different esoteric topics, of which astrology was one. And I thought, as the group had set up was particularly focused on astrology in its aim, I would do some more research and contribute some original articles on the different technical topics in areas of astrology, such as the individual planets, the moon's nodes, the Arabic parts, and so on. All these different areas in the houses. So I thought, well, to do this properly, I need more books. 60 was something, but I decided I need better sources. So I just kept collecting from there in order to build up a better research resource on which basis I could write these articles and contribute to this community, which was flourishing, and it grew and grew and had 6,000 people or something by middle of 2005. So it was doing pretty well. But by that time, I'd moved out to Sweden to join my then girlfriend, who had been one of the assistant managers in the same group. And she wanted to do a writing project with me. So I then took more of a back seat, particularly after our daughter was born in 2006. And I eventually resigned my position in that group. But I got a taste for researching the history of astrology, researching all the different sources and topics. And so I already had in my mind at that time that I was going to take this further and eventually create my own independent site, which I now have, astrolearn.com, and use this to continue what I had been doing. And in the meantime, I just kept collecting books. So it just became a massive ongoing research project. And it was probably 2 or 3 years after that that I first connected with you, probably in the late 2000s. And I remember you took a look at my chart and said that you thought I may have a destiny to fulfill in this area, and you were absolutely right. It's very insightful of you, and I think you were certainly somebody I very much looked up to, because, as you say yourself at the beginning of this conversation, you had done very similar things with your Heart Centre library, and you collected thousands of books and different periodicals and so on. So you were sort of my role model for creating an archive of this character. and I've had to take it at a fairly steady pace because there have been times when I've been pretty poor, but I've been tenacious. I've got natal moon in Taurus, and I've avoided selling anything which I don't have in duplicate. So it's just gradually built up, even with some pauses. And eventually, I moved back to the UK in 2016, and then established a larger space, which I have now in 2018, with more room for more bookcases. And that meant that it was no longer so cramped. It became very, very cramped in Sweden. And I now have upwards of, well, around 50 bookcases, 6-shelf bookcases, almost all of which are close to being completely full now.
Wow. Now I have to ask you something. Now, do you build your own bookcases or did you buy them?
I built them. I bought them from the Swedish company IKEA, which is all flat pack
Oh yeah.
bookcases. And with a bit of practice, once you've done a few, you get into the hang of it. So I built probably over 50 of those bookcases. And that includes also, I've built, because I've recently taken on an additional responsibility as librarian for the Astrological Association of Great Britain.
Oh
They
yeah.
dropped the of Great Britain part now, everything's more international, but that's what they were. And so I had to build an additional 20 bookcases or 19 or something to accommodate their books, which are upstairs. So I've got all mine downstairs and all theirs upstairs now. So it's getting quite a full house, but I'm gradually getting it organized, and I've been organizing duplicates to sell off recently. I sold 250 duplicates from the Astrological Association Library on their behalf earlier this year, and they still probably have 300 more duplicates to sell, maybe more than that. And I've also been putting together just in the last few days duplicates from within my own collection for sale. I've got about 260 of those catalogued so far. So there are ways to make the best of limited space, and selling off duplicates is one of them. So that's what I'm currently organizing. However, in the long term, it does occur to me that particularly if the Astrological Association Library and the one I've developed are going to stay together, and there would be some advantages to that because they're mutually complementary. The Astrological Association Library has some rarities, particularly from when the AA was getting going in the 50s and 60s, and some of their leading members at the time, possibly John Addy, Charles Harvey, people like that, were extremely thorough with collecting not only British and American sources, but also ones in German and French. So there are some rarities in the 50s and 60s, which I haven't been able to find secondhand, which are only in the AA collection. So I'm hoping that I'm going to band together with the AA and start some kind of fundraising campaign with them for a long-term permanent home that would be much roomier and very secure and would be able to accommodate both libraries.
Well, roughly how many volumes do you have of books or magazines or whatever? I think I sent you some magazines, if I
You
remember.
did very kindly. Yes, you sent me a whole lot of horoscope particularly from around the late 60s through to the late 90s, that sort of time frame.
Right.
And so that period for Dell horoscope is now extremely thorough. I still have some later and earlier gaps, but because I'd already collected some of those previously, it's pretty extensive, though it isn't complete. In terms of total numbers, I think the last time I checked, I had about 12,000, just over 12,000 unique issues of periodicals, which includes magazines, almanacs, and other sorts of annuals, which were occasionally released. And somewhere around 9,000 unique edition volumes of books,
Wow, that's a
which
bunch.
it's quite a lot, and they're either directly or indirectly related to astrology. There are some which are more tangential. For instance, I find in understanding the thinking of esotericists who did some astrology and some other similar subjects, it can be helpful to gather some of the other material too. So, for instance, there's an esoteric astrologer, or there was, called Douglas Baker, who was interested in all kinds of different esoteric subjects, such as healing and psychology. And although he's best known among astrologers for his 11-volume series of books on esoteric astrology, I thought while he was still alive, I would order from his shop quite a lot of his other material too. So I did that around 2010. And so I think there's quite a lot in terms of understanding the thinking of individual astrologers, where if they have written about other subjects, it can be helpful to get hold of some of their other material as well
Now,
for context.
do you have a list of, you have this all entered into the computer in terms of volume name and stuff like that?
Yes, I've got a complete catalogue which is full to overflowing now, because it's if anything, I over describe books. I'm guilty of going into too much detail on publication details and condition and binding and everything like that. But no, it's about 1,700 pages, the document now, and that includes
Wow.
all the periodicals being individually itemized and so on.
I think that's wonderful. You know, most of my materials are now at the University of Illinois Library.
Yes.
I still have a bunch. Maybe when I pass on, I'll send you a lot of the stuff I have personally,
That's very
just
kind
because
thought.
there may be stuff there that's kind of rare. But it's
Yes.
probably not so rare. It's mostly like early editions of stuff and stuff like that. I mean, I would have early editions of Astrology of Personality, and you mentioned Grant Louis. Grant Louis
Yes.
is one of the great astrologers, in my opinion. That his, Astrology for the Millions is a common idea now, but back then it wasn't, and that's an incredible book. And
Yes.
I'm pretty bright about books, and I'm pretty good at thinking, and that still stands out, even though anyone could read it as one of the great astrological treasures. Have you actually read it?
I have, yes. Well, I've read that and also Heaven Knows What,
Oh
because
yeah, that
I
too.
got hold of when I was just building up my collection before I graduated as a student. Those were I got the Llewellyn
Yeah,
reprints of both those volumes, and so they were among the early volumes. And the first 60 or so books I did read thoroughly, because I had time. I was very focused on learning then.
right.
Whereas later volumes, I'm sometimes guilty of just cataloging them and then getting on with other things, because I don't necessarily have time to read everything from cover to cover
Well, also, I think
alongside working.
it could ruin your mind, um,
Potentially.
potentially. And so, if you could characterize, what is your own interest or drift in astrology? What type of astrology do you actually enjoy? I mean, it's people are all different.
Yes, well, perhaps because I have Mars in Gemini natally, I'm quite versatile in my range of interests. I began practicing and learning as a modern astrologer, and I still find all the kind of modern technical research into the harmonics, into midpoints, into modern techniques and so on. And I know you've developed some modern techniques yourself, and in astrophysical directions, you were looking at galactic astrology and so on,
Right.
and you've looked at heliocentric, and then you've looked at three-way aspect patterns and so on. So I know that's something, modern techniques and innovative ideas, something of interest to you. But at the same time, when I was studying, there was all this, well, not only Project Hindsight, but the general movement towards rediscovering older texts going on. And so I have found that fascinating as well, because there are a lot of older traditional um, methodologies and interpretations of the houses and so on. So just as a researcher, I'm fascinated by seeing how the usage of the different elements of astrology has gradually evolved over time, and at different times people have altered the meanings of the houses or added something to them, and perhaps not used a previous one quite as much, even though it's never been formally undone, because there's never been any kind of centralized controlling body with astrology. It's always been this diversity of different astrologers in different countries basically taking the initiative and developing astrology according to their own taste. That's how I see
Well,
it, at least.
well, that's true. I mean, John Addy was a friend of mine, but
Yes,
a close friend of mine was Charles Harvey, who
yes.
I miss to this very day. Did you ever meet him?
I didn't have the chance to meet him, no, but I've heard a lot about him, because he was obviously very well known within the Astrological Association. So obviously people like Roy Gillett and Nick Campion knew him, and I know them. So
Well, he was just a really fine person. Now, do you share your birth information?
I have done, yes. Well, I shared it privately with you a long time ago, but I've also shared it with Astro Databank. So,
Can we just maybe I'd like to look at that right now. Is that
certainly.
okay with you?
Oh, please do.
And I can cut some of this out if it's not interesting to anyone else. But I am an astrologer. So what was your birth date?
It was the 26th of March, 1974.
Just a young person.
49 years old.
Well, I'm 82 at this point, so
it's all relative, isn't it?
It is relative. So what time was it?
And that was at 1:05 in the afternoon, local time, which was at that time British summertime.
Oh, this is very interesting. Something you will want to do, that I would suggest anyway, is that look at my chart sometimes, but look at the heliocentric chart. Because the heliocentric chart is basically a chart of our archetype, what Jung would have called archetype. And even though people don't understand the heliocentric chart because they say we don't live in the sun, we certainly live from and off the sun. Our every moment and every breath is from that. But you have a well, actually, I could share the screen. I think I could do that. I'm going to try to do that. Is that okay with you?
Certainly. Please do.
Tell me when you get it.
That's just come up now, yes.
Okay, so that's your chart in heliocentrics. You can see the Earth to the right in Libra. But what's interesting is that it's a pretty accurate grand trine. Certainly there's nothing else there. So the things that I find interesting about the chart instantly is, it's a trine. There are two archetypes, two grand archetypes. One would be in terms of what I call whole chart aspects that link around and create patterns.
Yes.
And grand trine is one, and the other one is a grand cross or a T cross. So now, so we look at this space here and space here and space here. This gives you a lot of internal stability, having everything balanced. A trine is the most perfect way of avoiding a square in the universe. So if we go and look at your geocentric chart, much more complicated, right?
Definitely. Yes.
It looks like a mystic rectangle and a grand trine and stuff. So you're really much more simple. Like the geocentric chart, I call the karma chart, right, because it represents the circumstances, the personal situation that we're born into. But who's born into that? And the one that's born into it is in my opinion, what I call the Dharma chart, which is the heliocentric. So now I want to go and show you my chart, this is going to really tickle you, I would bet. Look at that. Here we have the same kind of chart.
Quite similar, yes.
Mine's got 6 planets that make a trine, and they're pretty exact.
Yes.
So what's interesting about that? What's interesting about that is that this type of chart, one that's mostly soft aspects, like trines, sextiles, and stuff like that.
Yes.
That they're kind of the wallflowers. They stand back and watch. They observe and annotate. And I'm a total one of that. I mean, I'm an archivist and you're an archivist. So I think that we're not in a Grand Cross or T Cross, people with the heliocentric, that they're kind of the center of attention. They're more of a group leader. They make up the nucleus or the fun stuff of a group. Another way I say to myself, if you want to have fun, don't take me out to dinner. But if you're in trouble or you have any questions, then we should go out to dinner, because I'm good when people are suffering. I'm good when, and I'm very strong Virgo. So I care a lot about saving stuff, protecting stuff. and you do too, but I think that goes with the grand trine. And so that if you have never looked at your helio chart, you should, because that's really a tremendous archetype. And certainly it's like a calling card or validation of being an archivist. It's solely because the grand trine would be the best geometric pattern in order to take in everything else. Anything that was like remotely, 45, 90 degrees, squares and stuff. In fact, are you familiar with the Trojan asteroids?
The Trojan, well, I'm not quite entirely sure what that particular term means,
Basically, it says that there's a whole bunch of particles in the solar system that are situated at the grand trine points.
Oh, right.
Because that's the least that they can be most immobile there, right?
Yes.
And so particles park themselves there. So, but the same is true for us, in the sense that if someone like yourself is born, and we'll go back to yours, let's see if I can find it. Okay. So anyway, I'm not here to teach you astrology, but I can't help but share with you my thoughts of us as archivists, both having grand trines or close to it in our charts. It's just, to me, remarkable. It's not that your other chart, people always say I'm a heliocentric astrologer, but no, I'm someone that uses heliocentric astrology and geocentric astrology. But because I use helio, they say, well, you're heliocentric. But no, I wouldn't think of not, it's like the right and left hand. It's like one is a Dharma chart, which is the one we're looking at here, which is quite complex. But your actual geochart, this is the way the solar system was when you were born.
Yes.
And in the geocentric chart, it's just a view of that system, not necessarily the most correct view if you turn in terms of gravity and stuff like that. So, and the other charts, I also developed a chart called the local space chart. So it's a chart of azimuth and altitude, as if your dad picked you up when you were born and walked outside and there was Venus in the sky, also running through cities. So that direction. People have kind of taken to that because they like relocation, but they haven't taken the helio chart because they're not internally oriented. They don't look inside. They don't look within themselves, and they don't share. They're not sensitive enough to actually share with the sun. The most important astrologer for me ever was Theodor Landscheid. And I met him. I also sent him his first computer in 1978 because he had none, and there were none. But his work, his first book called Cosmic Cybernetics, is a pivotal book that's decades and decades beyond what astrologers are able to understand, or even scientists. So one of the things I did with Robert Schmidt lived with us for a number of years. In fact, it was here that he became an astrologer. So he told me that before that, he was kind of a mathematician and a physicist, and he didn't know what. And even as an astrologer, he was a kind of a unique kind. And he was one of my closest friends. I'm so sorry that he's gone. Now his wife is gone too.
And the fact that not a lot of people use it. I was going to suggest that possibly, historically, because when there was the heliocentric revolution in modern astronomy, there was a lot of opposition from astronomers after that to astrology and astrologers. Is there a possibility that astrologers for centuries after that were very resistant to the idea of a heliocentric astrology, almost because they felt as though they were being disrespected by modern astronomers?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think you're giving them too much credit from my point of view. I think that they're not just were they stubborn, but they're stubborn today. And the astronomers who were also astrologers back in the Copernicus time, they they understood what Copernicus pointed out, that everything does not revolve around us. In fact, we revolve around the sun, and they never accepted that, and they haven't today. And my point is that that wasn't just an observation. That was an enormous empowerment, an initiation that happened when the astronomers walked away with two charts where there had previously just been one.
Yes.
And the astrologers steadfastly maintain, oh no, everything's about us. It's just the geocentric chart. And they do it today. But also astronomy and botany are the two oldest academic disciplines. But astrology and astrologers, they're still struggling to live, right? It's not a good livelihood. I mean, when I first tried to get my first programmable calculator, I didn't have any money. And I went to the bank and I sat down, and he says, well, what do you do? And I said, well, I'm an astrologer. And I was very proud of being an astrologer. And he pulled out a sheet and he looked at the sheet and says, well, astrologers are listed as far as a risk just above migrant workers. And so I said, no, we're not going to give you any kind of loan. And I had to go back 3 times, and eventually they did. And then that's history. But I don't know where I'm just agreeing with you. And of course, I've written about this endlessly, about Copernicus and the fact that astrologers have yet to accept the sun and to identify with the sun as being the center of all life for us. But the Egyptians did, and other people have understood that. So, but anyway, I'm preaching to the choir. I understand from what you said. You understand what I'm talking about.
Yes,
so.
I do. I thought an interesting related observation historically on that is that in the late 19th century, there was briefly in the USA quite a strong interest in heliocentric astrology, but it doesn't seem to have lasted much beyond the turn of the century.
And who was doing that? I mean, the Butler book?
Hiram Butler, who
Right.
wrote Solar Biology in 1887, and he was talking very much about the sun as being extremely important, and he introduced the concept of the 144 solar lunar polarities, which was then followed by quite a few others, such as Alan Leo and Grant Louis later. And then after Butler, there was also Frank Earl Ormsby, who edited Planets and People, which was sometimes a magazine, sometimes an almanac, and he wrote this amazingly esoteric book, The Law and the Prophets, which was taking a heliocentric astrological viewpoint, at least partly. It wasn't really technically accurate heliocentrism. I think Butler's system was a kind of hybrid, partly geocentric. If you look at the text of Solar Biology, he reads the sun and moon signs geocentrically, but the planets heliocentrically. So it's a bit of a mishmash, but he was interested, and he sort of recognized conceptually that the sun is actually a very important perspective. It's just he wasn't perhaps technically proficient enough to know how to do all the calculations and make the best use of it.
But I can't help but wonder, what's the excuse that modern astrologers have for not embracing just the solar system view, just because it's so important to the solar system, right? It's our solar system, right? It's not like some big ball of gas out there. It's we're from that. We're born of that.
I think probably the geocentric rationale is simply that in order to differentiate between individuals that live on Earth, the relative positions of the planets at their moment of birth, from the geocentric perspective, are perhaps particularly obvious in differentiation from those of other people. And if you think of the Earth as being a kind of energy center around which all the other solar system bodies converge, and of the aspects, the geocentric aspects, as indicating the manner in which those energies interact on Earth, then I can see there's a rationale for geocentric astrology, and perhaps because that's been taught so consistently as being the way to do, and certainly personal natal astrology and personal predictive astrology, there hasn't been that much of a motivation for most astrologers to break out from that and to look at the heliocentric perspective. Although, of course, there have been exceptions, such as what I was talking about before with the late 19th century, and also around the time that you were researching it, and also T. Patrick Davis. And
No,
I think,
I got to interrupt you. T. Patrick
sorry,
Davis was applying geocentric astrology to heliocentric astrology. She never was empowered, as far as I could tell. I knew her, and also I studied what she did because I was interested in anything about that somebody else would know what I'm talking about. But I'm not trying to be pejorative, but I'm simply saying she never was initiated. She never understood the nature, which is quite different than geocentric astrology. I mean, in heliocentric astrology, and it's very clear in all her books, or whatever writings that she had. I can't remember exactly what it was. So, I guess that this is a cause that I've carried for a long time, so that I'm probably quite attached to it. It just, what my first book, which I published in 1975, was called "The Sun is Shining."
Yeah.
And it was a heliocentric ephemeris. You probably have a copy. If not, I could probably send you one.
I think I probably do. I can check. I'm fairly sure.
Was an ephemeris from what, 1650 to 2050 or something like that. That's a long, that's the first heliocentric ephemeris, short of the American Ephemeris and Nautical Almanac, that really was accurate within a couple of minutes of arc. That was kind of my Annie in. Right. I was sort of saying, okay, guys, here's something you should look at. And it also happened to me that way, in the sense that I was the first person to program astrology and make those programs available to everyone else. Right. And I didn't even have a business. I used to just give those programs away until I finally couldn't support my family. But anyway, I guess I'm pretty much wrapped up in becoming an evangelist. Never my intention. Just because when I discovered the heliocentric chart, to me I did the same thing T. Patrick did, which was just apply everything I learned geocentrically to the helio, right? But it never occurred to me initially that there was something else going on there. It wasn't just, for an example, I would say, well, my Mars and my geocentric chart is in Aries. That's kind of a hot Mars. But heliocentrically, it's in Aquarius. So I would say something to myself like, okay, you're a little bit of a hothead, Michael, and you're pretty aggressive. But maybe your aggression does things heliocentrically of an Aquarian nature. It may be that your action actually does something that benefits a group, or a group mind. So that was my way of thinking, but that was totally geocentric. But then in the middle of that process, over time, it slowly dawned on me that these large whole chart patterns, like the grand trine we looked at in your chart, they were an archetype. They weren't just isolated aspects and ticky, ticky, ticky. They were a whole chart. And when that happened, it wasn't long before I began to transmigrate my identification of myself from the geocentric chart to the heliocentric chart and say, oh, that's who I am. That's why I'm here. I've come here for this reason. And that I would always try to intuit that from the geocentric chart. Always. But I
Michael,
never got. What?
I know you've studied Buddhist ideas to an advanced degree. Do you think that the spiritual teachings you picked up during the course of that have channeled somehow into your wider perspective on different ways of looking at astrology too.
I think they go together. I was born to do both. When I went to Tibet to meet the young Karmapa, who's like the Dalai Lama, except that it's an older lineage. It's the 14th Dalai Lama, but the 17th Karmapa. He spontaneously gave me a name. He says, "You're Tenzin Nima." I'm Tenzin Nima, which means holder of the sun, keeper of the sun. So that's all I needed in terms of validation if I didn't, but I already had it inside because as I was trying to communicate, I was transmigrating right in my life and identifying with the heliocentric chart and realizing that the heliocentric chart is the mother and the geocentric, the child chart. That even if you do the calculations, you start with helio and then you convert it to geo, just technically, mathematically, at least that's the way it's always been done. So I'm just saying there's something bigger there than just thinking that everything's about us and our view from Earth. I'm not in any way taking it out. I'm not in any way saying that the geocentric chart is not accurate, but to me, it's accurate in the sense that it plots our circumstances, and I call it our karma. It's the situation into which we find ourselves. That's why I call it the karma chart. But the being that's born there. But yes, I've spent 50 years or 60 years studying Buddhism, and I didn't just casually start it out. We stay up late at night and drink coffee and talk about Buddhism or Ingmar Bergman or something like that. Instant coffee and powdered creamer and smoking cigarettes. That's what we did. But over time, when I met Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, for instance, who taught me to meditate personally, took me in a room and sat me down for a couple hours, then I realized that, no, this is so much more profound. Well, here's the way that maybe that would be the best to understand it, is that my teacher, who was a Tibetan Lama, who didn't speak any English ever, and he was 90-something years when he died just a couple of years ago, and I was with him for 36 years closely. And he knew that I cared about astrology. In fact, he came in at our center. We have a whole center that's been there for many years. He lectured on it, and he taught on it. And what he said to me was, "Michael, the astrology is one of the limbs of the yoga, no doubt, but it's not the root. Dharma is the root." And what he's trying to say is that astrology is like that old, chestnut of rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, right? You've heard that. Well, the point is that astrology can help us or help someone. I mean, for 9 years, I was doing charts for people to make a living. So I understood that. And the point of it is that you could, using astrology, help somebody recognize where they're at and relocate themselves to another part where they could live a better life and be happier. But it's either way, astrology is about samsara. It's about this world we live in. And geocentric people should identify with that, right? But it's not about the Dharma. The Dharma would be able to take us beyond just rearranging the deck chairs of our life, which is nice to do because astrology can help us do that. But anyway, that's how he taught it to me, if that makes any sense to you.
That's really interesting. I sort of feel there are, I haven't studied Buddhism in any depth, unlike you, but I feel there are perhaps resonances between his approach as a Buddhist and some of the Theosophists, the way they viewed astrology, where it wasn't so much the core of what they were doing, but it was a kind of support structure to their spiritual seeking.
Well, I was vice president of Michigan Theosophists for some years, and I know that Theosophy is basically Dharma or Buddhism through a glass darkly. It's just like a poor. It's not a proper view, meaning it's just something that it was their take on the Dharma, right? I'm sure that I have my take on the Dharma now, but I'm not totally knocking them up, but I'm certainly saying that it doesn't compare to actually doing the practices in the Dharma and looking at what are called the pith texts of Dharma. If you understand what I'm talking about, I'm saying Theosophy is just kind of like something that happened.
Yeah.
I don't think it's really looked at much anymore, but maybe it is.
But it was for its time. I've looked quite thoroughly through the old issues of Modern Astrology magazine and so on, which
Right.
I've got an extensive set out. And for its time, it's clear that it wasn't just Alan and Bessie Leo, but they had a whole kind of entourage of hangers-on and associates who
Yeah,
were
they
very,
did.
very interested in theosophy. And I suppose perhaps because they hadn't had the kind of culture to study Buddhism the way you have done, that was the kind of best thing available to them at the time. So in a sense, if you kind of look at it from that perspective, you sort of feel, well, they were honest seekers and they were doing their best with what was around in
I
the culture
agree.
at the time.
Except I'd have to say that they didn't understand the personality. They didn't understand the nature of the self. And they couched the whole thing in very selfish personal terms, when if they would actually have been trained by the Buddhists, you wouldn't do that. You would burn through that. The Buddhists don't think of ourselves as a being. What's the difference between what's called rebirth, taking another incarnation, and what's called reincarnation? The idea that, and this is more like a Sanskrit term, the idea that we're going to be reborn. This being, Michael Erlewine, is going to be reborn in the next life. And the Buddhists don't say that at all. They say, no, you're going to, they have what's called the Laya Vijnana, or the storehouse consciousness. And what that is kind of the remains of our desires, the things that we want, and our attachments are reborn. But they call it, they're very careful to say it's a rebirth, not a reincarnation. It's not Michael again with any memory, or very few do. I certainly don't have any. What they say is that we'll take on new parents, but our old traces, our old unfulfilled desires will be reborn in a new personality, new parents, and then live again. But the Theosophists were very much more into the idea that of a soul. The Buddhists don't believe in the concept of a ongoing soul that goes from life to life to life. Do you understand that, or
yes, I understand. Yeah, so there are distinct differences. I totally appreciate
this
that.
is probably something more than you want to get into. I'm just sort of,
No,
I apologize.
It's fine. It's fascinating. And but I was also thinking, when we were talking about the heliocentric astrology that you developed, you also then went on and released your book Astrophysical Directions in 1976.
That's right.
And would you say that looking at other galactic structures was a natural extension of the expanded perspective that heliocentric investigations gave you?
Well, yeah, I think that here's where the only astrologer I really learned from, I mean, I read all of Rudyard, and I met Rudyard and talked to Rudyard, talked about heliocentric astrology with him, which maybe I should talk to you about, but it's fascinating what happened. But it was, as I say, it was only Lanchite in his book, Cosmic Cybernetics. Cybernetics is, it's just simply the system, large-scale systems like a galaxy or like our body require a certain amount of information to be circulated in order to cohere, to not discorporate and die. And Landscheid was the first person to point out that cosmic cybernetics is something that we should look into. And astronomers and astrophysicists still having trouble figuring out what would be the mechanism, what would be the carrier of that information. And right now, they're kind of looking at, which I was looking at many, many years ago, gravitational wave, gravity waves. And this is an interesting idea if you can follow me. Light waves are dipolar. That means they go forward and backward, forward and backward. But gravitational waves are quadrupolar. That means they go forward and then another one goes like this. So they're going like this. And actually, a physicist said many, many years ago when I was writing that book, Astrophysical Directions, which took years to get ready to write that book, it says that gravity waves are so weak, in fact, it's called the weak force, that it would take an antenna, which would be a big cross, the size of the solar system, to be able to interpret and step down any information in gravity waves. Well, obviously the planets form crosses and trines. And so that's what I took from Landscheid. And then what I did with it is what I just said. I said, well, what about these large scale patterns that are being formed all the time? What if for instance, at your birth, when you were born, what if you were just the opposite of that? Instead of having a cross, you have the ability to be sensitive to crosses. So just like if I did a reading for you, I would have to say, well, you're much more sensitive. You're much more going to be working from the outside in instead of from the inside out. I don't know if you're following me, but I'm saying that what if that, and that's only present in it, those aspects don't hold up geocentrically. That means they're not based on the sun as the center, gravitational and stuff like that. So that's the difference between the patterns geocentrically and the patterns as seen heliocentrically. Am I getting too abstract?
No, it's fine. That's really interesting. No, I think I like the way that you are taking into consideration physical research and into fundamental particles and so on, because there's, I think, simultaneously with the sort of modern, I suppose you could call it the scientific approach to astrology, which was thriving in parts of the 20th century, there was also the kind of antithesis of that, of saying that everything is just symbolic and that it's futile to look into mechanisms and causes because there aren't any, and that there's this kind of attitude among quite a lot of modern astrologers that any kind of attempt to understand how astrology works physically is just absurd and a waste of time, and it isn't even worth considering because it's just a lot of symbols.
I totally agree. I mean, and I always try to say to people that kind of don't listen is that astrology is simply the interpretation of astronomy, cultural astronomy. And if you step away from it, as you pointed out, and just start thinking in terms of symbolic things, I don't know what you want to call it, but it's not astrology. Astrology has to be based upon the physical reality of astronomy. It's simply like the interpretation. Well, what does this astronomy, Saturn conjunct the moon, or like I was born also with the moon in Taurus. What does that mean? I think that was our job. And of course, we have so many different opinions of what that means. Yeah. Some of them make sense to me. I mean, just you have more books than I did. I don't even know, but I had a lot. The point is that most of those books were not worth reading. The truth, I mean, I kept it because as an archivist, you keep everything.
Yeah.
And you just want
Yeah.
to, as you know, you'd be one of the few people that knows,
Yeah.
understands that I don't just keep the good stuff, you keep
Yeah.
all of it. And
Yeah.
so that everyone in the future can then make their own decision about what's interesting or come into view or not. But most of those books, ridiculous.
There's also the element of understanding how they fit into the culture of the learning and the dissemination of astrological ideas. And if you take an academic cultural astrology approach, then all these even the popular strands of astrology are relevant because they're part of what was going on culturally in terms of how astrology was being practiced and used at different levels. So even if I think perhaps for somebody who was just a working professional astrologer, 90 to 95% of all astrology books published would not be necessary. But to an archivist, they're all meaningful, or most of
Right.
them at least.
I think we 100% agree on that, right? I mean, that's what an archivist is, right?
Yes. Yes.
And I also have studied and archived and created a huge database of rock and roll concert posters. I used
Yes,
to
I
be
remember you writing about that. Yes.
no, I think I wrote 300 books or booklets about it, and they're all available on my site. That again is a whole part. I think of myself as a cultural archivist.
Yes. Yeah.
And then astronomy is one of them. I mean, astrology, but then it's also music and film and stuff like that. That for some reason, I want to protect that. And you must understand this totally, because you're protecting astrology by archiving it.
That's right. Yes.
You're
Yes.
allowing you're messing with history because you're allowing the history to remain longer than it otherwise would.
That's a very interesting way to look at it. I totally agree. Well, because naturally documents dissipate, journals tend to have a very high rate of loss. People regard them as ephemeral.
That's right.
Most magazines, within a few months of their date, people have thrown out, and the few that survive often only survive for the lifetime of the owner, and then they're thrown out by the next person who clears up the estate and so on. So there are lots of publications. Which I find the periodical publications of 100 to 150 years ago, which are very, very scarce these days, absolutely fascinating, and the insights they give into how the astrological community functioned at those times, because when you just have the books, you're looking at a publisher's perspective on what would be marketable to a general learning audience, and quite a lot is missed out. Whereas if you look at magazines, you see all the letters, the correspondence, the debates, the arguments going on. It adds a completely different level of insight into the community.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're 100% on the same page. And that's also, I have a lot of books. I don't know if I have a huge collection, or relatively huge collection of books on feng shui. If you have any interest in any of that, probably you don't, but
I haven't learned it. I mean, I find all such concepts fascinating, but it's not something I've ever studied personally. So.
And you probably don't want to collect. I could send you all those books, but I probably should just stick with what you're doing. That I don't know what to do.
It might be safest, particularly because of the ultimate limited space in the property I own, and the fact that I can't really afford to upscale to anything bigger anytime soon. Obviously, there is the long-term hope that there will be some sort of fundraising for a permanent combined building for the Astrological Association's library and for mine, which would have more space and perhaps also include function rooms and be able to hire out a hall for other purposes, which would make it more self-sustaining and so on. But at the moment, space is an ultimate limiting factor in terms of shelves. So I think it's just better to stick with the astrology for that reason.
But then I have quite a few Chinese books on Chinese astrology. Mm-hmm. That's something you should have, because I think that's something that's grossly misunderstood, and that nobody even knows anything about it. I mean, or Tibetan. I had a lot of books, Tibetan books, but I gave them back to the Tibetans who can read them. I mean, I learned to read Tibetan, but it was pretty awful, and I never became any good at it. Anyway, so where are we at? So that I think this is good to talk. I mean, in a sense that I don't know why we haven't talked before, because I'm just trying to start to, since I'm old, I need to talk to people like yourselves while I can.
It's very good
And
to talk with you, Michael. And we've talked online a number of times in the past. I suppose partly I've always had a sense that you're somebody who's in a lot of demand. You know, your follower count on Facebook is always so many that you can't take on new friends and so on because you know so many people. So I've sort of felt, just from a humility point of view, I don't want to demand more of your time than you can really give. So I perhaps held back a little bit about uh,
well,
reaching out to you
that
to
you
some
shouldn't have
extent.
done, because you can have as much of my time as you want. Because I think of you as kind of a successor to what I did, and carrying on the tradition that I spent. You know, to make a library is a lot of work.
Oh, absolutely. It's
Yeah.
decades of work, isn't it?
And so that I think of you as a kindred spirit. That's why I'd like to send you this hard drive, and then you just do whatever you want with it. Or it may be good for other people, help other people who might do dissertations on this or that. There's a lot of stuff
Yeah,
there that
yeah,
is half done,
yes.
that you could just, you or someone, I think it's something that you should have, and you probably already do. If you don't, you should have as you can. That means it's hard to have buildings and do stuff, but totally.
Mm,
You need to have a place where people can come and access data
yes.
and come in and study, research it as part of your establishment. I don't know how you do it.
Definitely.
Maybe you're already doing it. And how can somebody access your list of books and or whatever? I'm going to send you,
Oh
a
well,
huge
the
amount.
list, the list, my basic catalog is just a Word document which I can very easily run off the latest version to a PDF file and send that to somebody by email, because the email all text document, might be just over 10 megabytes. It's not huge. Um, if people want to access, well, a longer term project will be trying to get more of the out of copyright books and journals online and more widely accessible. Um, and I'm also, you remember Jen's art because she visited you
Uh,
to pick up some books a few years ago.
yeah,
I'm working with her a little bit on her Kaylee project, which uses the various collections she's acquired, and I think she's quite interested in her project, which is called Kaylee,
oh, that's what I didn't know.
CELI. Yeah, yes, from the Latin for, or I think from the Latin for the sky. Um, and she's now combined the book she picked up from you with Capital College's library, which Capital College decided they no longer needed, and so she's looking after them both together at
Good.
this building in sort of between Seattle and Portland. And she's getting quite a lot of interest around that. She's a great networker, and so I'm hoping that at some stage we'll be able to collaborate on bringing more material into the digital realm and making it available to
That,
students.
that sounds good. Okay, I'm trying to think of, is there anything you want to tell me?
Um, well, I would just like to say how much I admire all the archival work you've done through the years, as well as the intellectual work you've done on developing ideas in astrology. And as I said towards the beginning, you're as good a role model as I can think of for the kind of work I'm doing today and have been doing for the last 25 or so years of my life. So thank you for
Well,
everything.
and I think that's how lineages are born,
Yes,
right? That we're in
yes,
the same
yes,
lineage. Uh,
yes.
and to me, looking at the heliocharts, our charts prove it. I don't need to, I can tell you that, but if somebody that's open-minded looked at your heliochart and looked at my heliochart, they can't not come away with, let's say, we both have our grand trines, right?
Yeah,
We
yeah,
have nothing in our heliochart. It's the chart of our heart, but there's no square there, no T cross, no grand cross. nothing like that in your chart, nor in mine. I mean, I have some individual squares which are not the same as a pattern. So that's the proof of the pudding to me. Anyway, the idea that anyway, that's just the way I think. Right.
Thank you for opening my mind to that. That was very fascinating, really.
Anyway, anything I can do for you, you always welcome. If you want to ever Zoom, I do it. You can always, but don't be shy about chatting me up, because I mean, I'm doing a lot of work, but someone like yourself, someone that I care about what you've done. I mean, you've actually done something, which is like most people haven't done much. So is that clear? I mean, yeah.
It is. Thank you very much, Michael. I really appreciate that. That's very good to know. And thank you for talking with me today as well. It's been a wonderful opportunity to speak with you face to face, even if it's from a distance.